All right, well, welcome back, everyone. So now we have a paper from Dean Moyar titled "Saving the Enlightenment from Itself." So he is a professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University. He's published extensively on classical German philosophy, especially Hegel, and is the author of Hegel's Value, Justice as a Living Good, and Hegel's Conscience, along with several edited volumes and around 40 articles and reviews. He is currently editing a volume on Moby Dick for the Oxford Studies in Philosophy and Literature series. I'm really looking forward to this paper, and I would just kind of note that I think these two books are, even though maybe not presented that way, maybe could be seen as a kind of direct response, sort of on behalf of Hegel, to MacIntyre's criticisms of the incoherence of modernity. So like I said, let's welcome Professor Moyar.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you, to all of the organizers for putting this together. And to all the speakers. I mean, I'm glad I'm speaking now, since both talks so far have me thinking I should rewrite big sections of this paper. I'm going to start in a bit of a biographical mode. I believe it was the fall of 1991 when I first read After Virtue as a sophomore at Duke in a directed study on virtue ethics. Father Ed Mahoney had helped me to convince Michael Farragon to do some reading with me in and around Aristotle's Ethics. And the rebel in me found MacIntyre's counter-enlightenment stance exhilarating, though in retrospect, I look askance at my earlier self's simultaneous embrace of an aristocratic ethics and my Southern fraternity's advocacy of the true gentleman. But such is the narrative unity of life, one among many ideas I absorbed from After Virtue, that I feel I could not have come across a better book at a better time. The communitarian claims gripped me, not least because MacIntyre praised my own Greek American Orthodox community. The skepticism about natural rights intrigued me and spurred me into another directed study on the historical origins of the concept. The liberalism communitarian debate was, to me, the liveliest one going, and it led me inexorably, I would say, into my career in the Hegelian branch of classical German philosophy. I confess I thought that debate was settled in the 90s in favor of liberalism, because no one found a coherent or convincing way to repudiate individual rights. It is one thing to reject natural rights as a theoretical fiction, along with Bentham, Marx, and MacIntyre. It's quite another thing to recommend a regime in which individual rights are not respected. Virtue certainly took off within ethical theory, but in the domain of politics, there was no getting around the protections that modern rights afford the individual. No one but Marxists really dared to question the Lockean framework of life, liberty, and happiness, at least not in the US or post-Cold War Europe. Well, things have changed in the US and parts of Europe in the past 6 years or so. The national conservative movement has found intellectual support from anti-liberal MacIntyreans like Patrick Deneen, with some explicitly arguing for the return of virtue over the freedom of right. The alignment with Trumpism gives this movement a viability that the leftist foes of liberal rights never managed in the US. The recent repeal in the US of reproductive rights gives a clear non-theoretical meaning to a world without rights. Although I should say I'm very glad to hear from Jennifer Hurt that MacIntyre himself seems to have repudiated some of this. Now, one problem with an Aristotelian or Thomist worldview is how to conceive of the return of virtue in a rights-based era. You might say that you do not want us to think of the state as an enforcer of virtue, but without a public and legal encoding of virtue, it is not clear what type of restoration of virtue is being advocated. Hegel, who saw ancient and Christian virtue as largely ideas of the past, took a more realist stance toward the kind of social unity possible today. Over the appeal to feeling, harmony, mere substance. Of course, he too is an Aristotelian of sorts, and he is known as one of the foremost critics of social contract theory in modern political thought. Yet there is an unmistakable preference for the modern project in his writing. a desire to save the Enlightenment from itself, rather than to repudiate it as a complete failure. A large part of this story is a return to teleological thinking, and much of my case today will be an attempt to understand how and why Hegel thought such a return and reconciliation with right was and is possible. Before I begin the body of the paper, I have to say that my references are also mainly to After Virtue, though I implicitly refer to his subsequent view when I attribute to him a more substantive virtue ethics. So the paper has 4 sections. First, a shared critique of the Enlightenment. In After Virtue, MacIntyre argues that the disaster of emotivism and existentialism and intuitionism is the result of the failure of the Enlightenment project of justifying morality. All we are left with is radical choice, feeling, and mutual manipulation. Now, oddly enough, given his overall pro-Enlightenment stance, Hegel himself presents the main outlines of this critique already in the Phenomenology of Spirit and Philosophy of Right. In this section, I briefly highlight the similarities of their critiques in order to ask, in the following section, how Hegel could nonetheless find something redeeming about the failures of modern morality. There are, of course, aspects of MacIntyre's view, especially when he relies on Nietzsche and Weber, and when he criticizes post-war social science, that were not available to Hegel. It might, in fact, be that the past 200 years have proven, historically, that Hegel was simply wrong in his optimism about modern freedom. But we could also argue that Hegel's successors, such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, were misguided in their aspirations for modern life, that they set their bar too high in certain respects. They did not heed Hegel's second negation, the negation that removes the sting of the first by eliminating the expectations that went with the original culture of transcendence. So to begin briefly with a comparison on the excesses of subjectivity in Hegel and MacIntyre's criticism of emotivism and the culture of radical choice. Contestable as it is in its details, I find MacIntyre's account of emotivism and the critiques of morality that preceded it to have an undeniable force. The presentation of G.E. Moore's intuitionism as a desperate attempt to save morality and the embrace of emotivism in England by Bloomsbury Group and others all make perfect sense against the background of a 19th century culture and theory that had come to see questions of value as rationally undecidable. MacIntyre's diagnosis has clear predecessors in Hegel's worries about the appeal to feeling, the arbitrary decisions of subjective conscience, and the ironic stance that sets the individual power of judgment over objective norms. Hegel's memorable portrayal of the spiritual animal kingdom in the Phenomenology already sees the normative as simply and solely an expression of one's own original nature, and some features of conscience in later sections indicate a subject beyond all norms. Of course, Hegel didn't think we were compelled to take that stance, unlike some of his successors, but he goes so far as to call subjective freedom the sickness of the age, and he worries that inner feeling and arbitrary choice will override any sense of objectivity in ethics. How did we reach this situation? MacIntyre traces this development back to Luther and his denial that we can have knowledge of human nature sufficient to ground a teleological ethics. There seems to me a bit of a jump in After Virtue from the Reformation denial of reason to the project of the Enlightenment. We are told in a parenthetical remark that Hume was raised a Calvinist, but the transformation of knowledge in Lutheran theology seems a bit undermotivated. From the denial of a prior a priori knowledge, the Enlightenment project of exploring human nature through empirical means was born, and that project, dealing as it did with theoretical facts, could not reconnect to the older normative framework of teleology. Hegel too traces modern freedom to Luther, though more often in the sense of giving him credit than in the sense of casting blame. Yet he does find in radical Protestantism, in particular in Schleiermacher's theology of feeling, an opposition to the objective and to religious doctrine that he worries leads to emptiness. Hegel comments on the turn by some thinkers, such as Friedrich Schlegel, back to Catholicism in recoil from the emptiness of mere subjectivity. Say what you will about the authoritarianism of the Catholic hierarchy, at least it has a doctrine and a tradition. Of course, a large part of the story untold in After Virtue and terribly compressed by Hegel is the world that arose on the basis of Roman property law. MacIntyre tends to treat rights under the rubric of natural right, and natural right he treats as a fiction. Hegel is known as a critic of abstract right, arguing that the social contract tradition, against the social contract tradition, that the person and contractual relations cannot be the main mode of sociality. In his brief description of Rome as the world of legal status, he portrays a scene of individual isolation and political tyranny. One of the most damning elements of the view of the Enlightenment in Hegel and MacIntyre is the tendency of its morality to devolve into mutual manipulation. MacIntyre argues that the manager who sees workers as useful is a descendant of the breakdown of morality that was already evident in the young star of Diderot's Rameau's nephew. Hegel himself gives Diderot's text a major part in the Phenomenology, and his portrayal of the Enlightenment holds that it is a world without intrinsic value, in which all use and are used by others. MacIntyre is worried about both the familiar modern business type and the less familiar modern aesthete, for whom people are to be used to fend off boredom. Now, the Kantian solution to the problems of the Enlightenment morality is a dead end for MacIntyre. He basically accepts Hegel's critique of Kantian morality as an empty formalism. MacIntyre simply agrees that the universality of law in Kant provides no rational justification for morality, and thus offers no way out of the Enlightenment failure to justify morality. So both Hegel and MacIntyre hold that the contradiction that Hegel thinks generates determinate prohibitions does not really prohibit anything. As MacIntyre notes in After Virtue, Kant himself acknowledges that without a teleological framework, the whole project of morality becomes unintelligible. The Humean gap between ought and is figures prominently in MacIntyre's account of where the Enlightenment went wrong. Bringing these two worries together, the core problem is that the theoretical and practical have come undone. There are facts about human nature available through empirical science, and there are moral rules, but there are no facts about the telos of human nature that could justify the oughts of morality. A major question for my paper is what Hegel's critique of the Kantian ought says about his own view of teleology. To the extent that Kant and other idealists maintain an unreachable ideal towards which we should strive, Hegel appears to dismiss the claim as an empty ought that shows its illusory status by falling short of what is. He objects, along with MacIntyre, that they cannot locate a rational world of value or a subjectivity that would find its goal realized in that world. Both say that in abandoning teleology, they abandon any hope of a robust ethics. Section 2, the preservation and elevation of Enlightenment concepts. From the above, one could be forgiven for thinking of Hegel as a preeminent critic of the modern social order and as an advocate of a return to the Greek polis and the classical conception of the good life. As much as he was tempted that way at various points in his development, in the end, he embraces the modern world and finds a place for every one of the concepts that he criticizes in their shallow, one-sided, isolated form. To some extent, Hegel's embrace of the modern liberal order reflects a general historical and methodological thesis about finding the rational in the world one lives in. Trying to turn back the clock to the Greek world is a wishful fantasy that spares itself the trouble of investigating what is good about our world. But he also holds the modern world to be better, and this presents us with a puzzle when we see that the very ideas he criticizes are also ones that he comes to endorse. For the initiated, we can invoke here Hegel's famous use of the German verb aufheben to characterize his dialectical cancellation, preservation, and elevation of specific moments. The cancellation we saw in part 1, section 1, that shows the bad results from taking the idea or the moment to be absolute or the exclusive norm. The concept is preserved as valid within limits, and it is elevated insofar as it stands in relation to other concepts and is part of their justification. Before returning to the puzzles of this innovation, I want to rehearse a few of Hegel's endorsements of central modern ideas. So, of course, Hegel's main work of practical philosophy, the philosophy of right, argues for the right to property as the fundamental right of the system of freedom. It is a direct expression of the person who is both abstractly universal and completely particular. I'll come back to this later. While officially his account of the system of right is based on the rational will and not by the thinner volitional capacity of choice or Willkür, at very many points he endorses choice as a key part of modern normativity. Against arranged marriage, Hegel supports the choice of one's partner. He also holds that one should be free to choose one's career. And in support of the state, he cites the freedom of choice rather than compulsory service of a specific kind. His bark against social contract theory is thus much worse than his bite. Same holds true of utility. An overlooked point in the phenomenology of spirit is that the relational value that he calls utility, or the truth of the Enlightenment, is an essential part of the practical objectivity that he outlines and endorses in absolute knowing. Every action has a specific purpose on a specific interest. And in the philosophy of right, this is the moment of subjective value in the morality section. Of course, he does not endorse using other people for one's selfish ends, but he does endorse individual interest as an essential aspect of modern ethics. He also thinks of welfare in general as the proper goal of the modern civil authorities. As for the universal duty of Kantian moral philosophy, Hegel does not give up on the basic ideas. That is, he thinks of the law or universality as another essential moment of action. In fact, he identifies it with the essence itself in the Phenomenology. And he thinks that acting from duty or for the right reasons is a key element of ethical agency. He agrees with Kant about the highest good as well, but he takes teleology to be actualized rather than merely presupposed as an ideal. What about the individual conscience that is supposed to be a recipe for hypocrisy and for a stance of ironic superiority to the ethical order? Conscience ends up being a hero of the phenomenology story, and in the philosophy of right, the moment on which the entire argument pivots. Wary of the conscience that insists on its authority against the civil law, Hegel nonetheless celebrates conscience as a key achievement of modern freedom. Drawing on and revising the millennium-long tradition of reading conscience as part or all of practical reason, Hegel finds its power to consist both in the ability to suspend the separate, determinate duties and the ability to recombine them in particular inferentially loaded judgments. So how, you might be wondering, can Hegel pull off this affirmation of modernity when he agrees with so much of the criticism that is echoed in MacIntyre's work? Again, initiates are likely to appeal to the Aufhebung or to the self-referring negativity of the concept. But these concepts and powers, real as they are, seem to do no more than to show that we can act well under modern conditions, that the agent and philosopher can hold together a host of competing commitments. Hegelians will add to these terms the form of life as an organic reciprocity of whole and member, a system of self-reinforcing institutional powers. But the most powerful and recently most discussed tool for Hegel's resuscitation of modernity is mutual recognition, first brought to prominence in modern scholarship by Ludwig Siep and explicated recently at great length by Robert Brandom. Put the rich theory of recognition in one sentence, one can claim authority for oneself only to the extent that one grants the same authority to another and is granted authority by that other in turn. The authority in question can take a wide variety of forms, but paradigmatically, it is the authority to say what actions have meaning, are free, or valuable. There simply is no way to do these things outside of structure of mutual recognition. Now, could MacIntyre and other neo-Aristotelians find common cause with Hegel around the theme of mutual recognition? In posing this question, I was reminded of MacIntyre's comments on sympathy in Hume and Smith. I won't read the full quote from page 49 in After Virtue, but he says sympathy as used by Hume and Smith is the name of a philosophical fiction. I suspect that MacIntyre would direct some of the same skepticism towards the discourse of mutual recognition. Like sympathy, mutual recognition can seem to conjure community out of quite thin materials. And we are right to press advocates of mutual recognition and of the second person standpoint in recent discussions for a concrete account of how the obvious ills of modernity could be ameliorated if we get this intersubjective relation right. For this to be fruitful, we need to get clearer on Hegel's conception of rationality and the question of practices in his account. Okay, Section 3, inferentialism, teleology, and practices of value. MacIntyre, in the postscript to the second edition, is quite disappointed with what he takes to be contemporary philosophy, restricting its activity to the drawing of valid inferences. He writes, drawing on Rorty, quote, "The consequence is that analytic philosophy has become a discipline, or a subdiscipline, question mark, whose competence has been restricted to the study of inferences." This critique resembles the position taken in Hegel's day by F.H. Jacobi. The reason that Jacobi made a big deal of this is that he thought reason so conceived could only amount to a hyper-rationalist Spinozism that was fatalistic and atheistic. His solution was to look to immediate knowledge, a direct realism of the world, self, and God. That solution is not at all amenable to MacIntyre, but I think the diagnosis of inferential reason is quite similar. If reason can only connect premise to premise, but not provide an ultimate ground or telos for the series, then the only necessity there is tarnished by arbitrary value positing, or what amounts to the same thing, nihilism. The philosopher who first tried to solve this problem and failed was J.G. Fichte. He tried to give a version of the self-conscious subject that could provide an absolute ground, and then he combined this with a derivation by dialectical inference of the determinate forms of objectivity. The result is brilliant, but so fraught with internal tensions that Fichte himself could not settle on a clear expression of the view. But for Hegel, this idealism was just one speculative step away from the right position on immediacy and mediation. So what I want to say in this section in brief is that Hegel's anti-foundationalist teleology goes together with his arguments for preserving the modern and protecting us from its bad tendencies. The critique of inferential reason can read like a critique of coherentism generally, and then one is forced, as Fichte was, to a kind of foundationalism to anchor those inferences in self-consciousness. Jacobi aimed to do without essential inferences altogether, and he, like MacIntyre in his subsequent Thomistic work, will give God a special role in doing what human reason manifestly cannot. For Hegel, who is not quite a theist in a traditional sense, there is a different option, that of seeing the immediate and mediated self and other, God and creation, infinite and finite, as always interrelated, such that one cannot provide independent support of the other. So you can see how this would help with disallowing the individual subject from claiming self-sufficiency. I'm always mediated in my dependence on other subjects who have raised me and who take up my actions. A challenge of this view is saying how the immediacy is preserved. So it would fall back into Jacobi's criticism if we just saw ourselves as nodes in a matrix of rational relations. To put it another way, could the rational relations of dependency still retain their validity if the immediate retains an undigestible givenness within those relations? Now, this question appears to have a real bite because we are so used to aligning immediacy and content on the one hand and mediation and form on the other. We seem forced to choose between an account of formal, mediated, ideal relations on the one hand and the primacy of content, immediacy, reality on the other. But Hegel's innovation, elaborated in more recent times by Sellers and Brandom, is to think about inferences as both material and formal. The formal validity of an Aristotelian syllogism is an abstraction that plays only a peripheral role in the inferences that make up everyday reality. I cannot defend Hegel's overall idealism here, but I'll try to explain briefly how in the practical sphere, the theory of inferences can mitigate the risks of subjective freedom. The conditions that secure validity for practical inferences are quite varied and prominently feature content or material elements, such as the obtaining of specific circumstances in the world. Since the main relations to be captured in such inferences is that between an intention and its realization, I call this validity expressive. An action conceived as a practical inference of end, means, and realization will have various kinds of conditions on its success. Some will be centered on the individual, some on the immediate social context of recognition, and some will be informed by larger historical contingencies that determine, for instance, what counts as an appropriate means to an end. And I would add here, just drawing on the discussion from Bob Stern's great paper, that part of the story here is that we don't know when we're acting if all those conditions are always met. It's not a subsumptive inference of something into a logical, it could be subsumed into a more formal logical validity. Now, with such an expressive conception in place, it is not too hard to see how Hegel's view could be essentially teleological. If validity is not an all or nothing formal matter, but rather a question of lesser or greater validity depending on a host of factors, then the telos of full validity makes sense of action. It is much harder to say exactly what this telos is and whether or not it conforms to the teleology that MacIntyre thinks is missing in the modern world. I mean, we have already seen one candidate for teleology. The full mutuality of mutual recognition is a clear candidate. When agents whom I recognize as sources of authority recognize my action as expressing my intention and recognize that intention as aiming at universal goods, a major telos will be reached. But as I mentioned above, mutual recognition on its own is not enough. In its mere formal version that he sketches at the beginning of chapter 4, section A in the Phenomenology, it's hard to see how this mutual recognition, which seems to be symmetrical, how it doesn't end up being just as formal as some of the other versions that he criticizes. So I would want to embrace a lot of what Bob said about having to sort of work through and work over the obstacles to one's action or one's pursuit of the good on the way to getting there. So without other elements than just the mutuality of mutual recognition, recognition tends to become indistinguishable from formal agreement. And what I've argued in this recent book on Hegel's value is that the freedom from nature that Hegel so often emphasizes is always paired with an acknowledgement that life is coessential with the freedom of thinking self-consciousness. The telos of serving the ends of humans as natural beings thus also belongs to the Hegelian picture. And this element ties into the conception of utility that I mentioned above. But my own welfare, recognized as legitimate as a natural being, is a pretty weak telos. Hegel endorses a stronger universal telos. And yet he is wary of the Kantian and Fichtean abstract ideal of full rational community, a kingdom of ends that can never be reached in practice. His telos is therefore a very complicated, differentiated ensemble of practices, institutions, with the state and absolute spirit representing the whole. These brief comments on teleology and sociality are meant to bring out the similarities of Hegel's view to MacIntyre's. We could increase this sense of overlap with MacIntyre's view of a historical tradition and note how close this is to Brandam's recent Hegelian picture. But given Hegel's endorsement of a wide range of specifically modern ideas, this similarity would seem to paper over some deep differences with MacIntyre. One natural place to look for differences would be in their views of human nature. But that difference is rather hard to pin down, especially with After Virtue as our only text. I think MacIntyre's understanding of a practice offers a better route to bringing out the crux of their difference. A central element of MacIntyre's view of a practice is that there are goods internal to practices. That is, there are specific goods or values that can only be realized through, for example, the writing of novels or the playing of chess or the crafting of furniture. This is a familiar point to readers of Plato, shepherding, medicine, music, but MacIntyre took a bold step in bringing it back to life for us. It would not seem too difficult for Hegel to adopt this point for his understanding of the institutions of ethical life. His important portrayals of the family and civil society would seem to invoke a distinction in kind between the goods of the family and the goods of the workplace. And yet, even with this deep appreciation of Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Ethics, Hegel does not seem very concerned to dwell on the distinctness of the goods in the various institutions. And there's a question here of why not? Now, one of Hegel's overriding concerns is with systematicity. This means leaving no item that is not mediated by something else with which it stands in relation. To have a system of practices that are mutually conditioning, Hegel finds it necessary to think of the goods of those practices as not so distinct or isolated that they can't be brought into relation with the goods of other institutions and practices. But to bring them into relation to others would seem to make them external to the distinctive practices, or rather, we would have to find a way to convert the internal goods into external goods to some extent, without, however, losing the distinctive character of those internal goods. We would need a conception of the good that includes the thinner and more naturally quantifiable notion of value. And this is just what he develops in the philosophy of right as a way of mediating between institutions and between the modern individual's different roles within those institutions. Now, there is a tendency in the literature towards mystification in theories of value. So I'll just say a couple words on what I've tried to do with this view. I've argued that Hegel's a precursor of theories known as fitting attitude accounts of value. The valuable is what it is rational to desire, care about, etc. Without going into the details, the main point is that the element of human nature that is appetitive is preserved on the side of attitudes. And yet it is also subordinated to the idea of reason and the fittingness or rationality of those attitudes. So Hegel can give a basic starting point in needs and desires, and an elevation to thought in the idea of a measure that represents, qua universal, a certain potential to satisfy needs and desires. And this is what he does in section 63, 64 of the Philosophy of Right. It is, of course, a matter of mutual contestation and recognition how such measures are calibrated. And value, in this sense, indistinguishable from the good in some ways, but also thinner than it, value operates at every level of right, not just at the level of property. In punishment, in morality is subjective interest, in the good is the overarching equivalence of individual rights. So what I want to stress is that Hegel's qualified but enthusiastic endorsement of modern freedom goes together with an endorsement of an elastic conception of value and a porosity of the individual external value divide within modern practices. So to restate that, there's a porous barrier between internal and external goods. The case of the state is undoubtedly the most dramatic in Hegel's telling. He's famous for elevating the state to a quasi-god on earth and for making patriotism an important part of his theory of the modern state. Commentators have wanted to find in his theory a concern for the distinctive goods of public service and participation in the state's activities, or at least in political forms of association. But one looks in vain for a robust theory of political activity in Hegel's modern state. In direct contrast to Rousseau, Hegel celebrates taxation in the form of money. He writes in section 299, "But as for services to the state, it is only when these are expressed in terms of money, as the existing and universal value of things and services, that they can be determined justly, and at the same time in such a way that the particular work and services which the individual can perform are mediated by his own arbitrary will." Right? So this, I think in a nutshell, sort of shows Hegel where he's supposed to be at the most critical of modernity in his theory of the state, in fact, endorses the particular Willkür, the choice, thin notion of the good, money, as what mediates. Hegel does not, however, want this to count against one's identification with the state and its universal purpose. You still have to be willing to sacrifice your life in wars of self-defense for Hegel, even after that statement about the importance of money in the modern world. I should not think that because I'm doing my civic duty in money, that I have a merely instrumental view of the state. But insofar as the state's ultimate authority is based on its complete mediation of individual and universal, it would make no sense to exclude this thinner conception of value from the state's purview and from my relationship to it. All right, I've come to section 4, final section, right over virtue. Once Hegel's argument for modernity is cast in terms of value, it might seem that he falls back into a familiar liberal picture in which political right is simply contrasted as a separate normative domain to ethical virtue. On this view, right concerns those externalities of action that can be coerced and that must be coerced in order to maintain the peace between naturally self-seeking individuals. If there is a conception of the good on this standard liberal view, it must be a thin conception because that is the only one that all citizens of a pluralistic state could agree to. Morality and virtue, on the other hand, can be individual or at least private in the sense that their thicker values are tethered to communities that are non-coercive. A thicker conception of virtue belongs there in the private rather than in the public domain, where virtue involves dispositions that cannot be coerced and patterns of behavior that are not suitable for adjudication by courts of law. To MacIntyre and to many other virtue theorists, this liberal conception just seems like giving up on the ethical project. At best, you are left with an alienated self caught between private and public personae. At worst, the thin public realm takes over the private and one is left without a meaningful self at all. Now, Hegel certainly did reject the liberal dichotomy that was endorsed by his predecessors, Kant and Fichte, who had made a divide between morality and right central to their views. Hegel thought that right without morality was going to produce a machine-like minimal state, and morality without right was going to be empty, a theory of good intentions and empty ideals. The theory of Sittlichkeit, ethical life, is supposed to unite the two domains in thicker ethical contexts. So does Hegel end up on MacIntyre's side after all? Now, the central category of Hegel's view is right. That's where he begins. That's the name of the book. The good appears in the middle of the book. And then everything after that point in the middle of the book where he introduces the good could be seen as an expression of the good. But the central category of Hegel's view is right. And he has a minimal and inclusive conception of what the right is. This is section 29. Right is any determinate being or any existence, Dasein in general, which is the determinate being or existence of the free will. That's it. And this goes back to what Bob Stern was saying about the free will in 5, 6, and 7. He's just sort of stating that that is the basis of this view. This comes on the heels of an analysis of the free will as a power of abstraction and redetermination, and a famous invocation of friendship as the free will in its full form in section 7. The theory of right is thus a theory of action, and it begins with exclusive property relations. That fact of personal right and the overwhelming importance of property in the modern order already diverts Hegel from pure ethical theory. The theory concerns universal standards of human cooperation and flourishing on the basis of a primordial connection of individual to thing in property. And yet the ultimate telos of the account is a theory of social institutions in which we follow custom, living out a second nature without constantly reverting to the abstractions of choice. Does his view imply an account of human nature, such that the fulfillment of right, the living of a fully virtuous life, would be the realization of the telos of the human being? So can you do both? Can you start with right, have as your ground level of right, exclusive property relations, then develop a full-blown social theory? Are those two things actually harmonious, and does he require and have a theory of human nature that would make them coherent if we follow the standards of coherence that MacIntyre sets in after virtue? So Hegel does have a theory of the drives that looks like a theory of human nature, but those drives do not have a straightforward telos like what we would associate with merely natural beings whose ends are set by their nature alone. In the encyclopedia, he unpacks his claims about the teleology of the drives in aligning his view of right and spirit with Plato's parallel of man and city in the Republic. I'm not going to give you this full quote. I'll read the first and last sentence of it. It begins, the formal rationality of the drive and of inclination consists only in their universal drive, not to be subjective, but rather through the activity of the subject itself to suspend the subjectivity, to become realized. That's their telos, is to become realized. And then he says, it is this objectification in rights and duties which displays the content of the drives as well as their relationship to each other, in general, their truth. Thus, it was with genuine insight that Plato showed that he could explain what justice is in and for itself only in the objective shape of justice, namely in the construction of the state as the ethical life, and also that he included the whole nature of spirit under the right of spirit. This is Encyclopedia 474, the remark. So what we learn from this passage is that the telos of the drives is to take shape in an ethical community as rights and duties. Hegel invokes Plato in a way that would seem to align his view with the virtue ethics espoused in Plato's Republic. This would seem like just the sort of thing that a MacIntyrean should go for. It is a teleological view of human nature in which the oughts of public life have their origin in the is of human nature. And yet, as we have seen in section 2, Hegel embraces a moderate form of the modern picture that MacIntyre wholeheartedly rejects. The reason for this is that Hegel's teleology of practical objectification runs through the logic of the free will, whose moments include abstractive thought and determinative choice. Those are redeemed from MacIntyre's criticism in Hegel's view through being taken up into processes of mutual recognition and value realization. The first move in the main text of the philosophy of right, namely personal property, already gives human nature an exclusive individual objectivity. One can reject this move outright, the move to begin with individual property rights. But then one is either doing ethics rather than politics, or one has started down the road of a fantastical political imaginary of virtuous power without right. We can gain further insight on Hegel's view of the modern world by looking at one of his most prominent statements about the transition from medieval Christian virtues to modern ethicality. In each case, there is a shift from something that would cultivate the self as part of a relation to the divine, to an institution in which one relates to other human beings in a scene of recognition. He writes, this passage is from Encyclopedia 552 are, but once the divine spirit introduces itself into actuality, and actuality emancipates itself to spirit, then what in the world is supposed to be holiness is supplanted by Sittlichkeit. He's describing the birth of the modern world. Instead of the vow of chastity, marriage now counts as the ethical, and therefore as the highest on this side of humanity stands the family. Instead of the vow of poverty, muddled into a contradiction of assigning merit to whosoever gives away goods to the poor, i.e., whosoever enriches them, what counts is the activity of acquiring goods through one's own intelligence and industry, of rectitude in commercial dealing and in the use of property, in short, Sittlichkeit in civil society. Instead of a vow of obedience, what counts is obedience to the law and the legal arrangements of the state, an obedience which is itself the true freedom, because the state is a self-possessed, self-realizing reason, in short, Sittlichkeit in the state. So there may be something heroic about the monastic vows, yet the heroism is in self-denial. The value of these vows amplifies thought over life, but they are lacking in the side of value that is life-affirming, in which one accomplishes activities that affirm one in one's individuality and universality. Hegel thus also criticizes Plato for banning private property from his state. He thinks of the move as an overreaction to the sophists' individualism and relativism. And I would not deny the nobility of the monastic life, yet it can hardly count as virtuous by Aristotelian standards, as MacIntyre himself points out in After Virtue, though the subsequent picture is more complicated. And Hegel's alternative, as presented here, is clearly too institutional and too individualistic for MacIntyre, incorporating choice and celebrating the acquisition of property. Now, it's hard to deny that what Hegel is celebrating is bourgeois life and bourgeois virtues. He does bring further specificity to this account in some of his lectures about the virtues of different classes, and he did believe to some extent in national customs or virtues. But the devastating Nietzschean critique of the bourgeois as the last man lingers around the Hegelian subject. What can there be to celebrate in the life of the nuclear family and the respectable career? There's the mutual love and support of one's spouse. There are the joys and stresses of child raising. There are the choices of commodious buildings and the obedience to the 30-year mortgage. We belong to professional associations and attend conferences. We harvest our retirement accounts for some day long distance. We have the leisure to appreciate art and the option to worship and read the newspaper. We can engage in political campaigns, serve on juries, cast votes. So I think we do ourselves wrong in calling all of this mere comfort and mere security. And if you think family and career are easy, you obviously haven't reached them yet. Unlike my younger self today, I find it rather dispiriting that MacIntyre celebrates Nietzsche's criticisms, even while being rightly skeptical of Nietzsche's positive programs for the future. To me, the scorn of bourgeois life is too often itself an expression of the modern aesthete's point of view. From the outside to the aesthete, ordinary life in an American suburb is quite boring, but contemptible, sign of the rot of civilization. There are a lot of bad marriages and bad jobs, not to mention bad states. And this for Hegel would mean there is a lot for morality and virtue to do. He has a place for being virtuous without really trying, but his claims about a separate sphere of morality show that he is expecting there to be an effort to achieve its characteristic excellences. Now, there's a danger in overstating the divergence of Hegel and MacIntyre. For MacIntyre makes an important distinction between practices and institutions. In MacIntyre, institutions do these things with external goods. They need to deal with external goods. This is page 194 of After Virtue. So he agrees with Hegel that within institutions, internal and external goods are inseparable. But there is obviously still a difference between a theory of right that culminates in institutions and a theory of virtue that is centered on practices. So we can still ask, why does Hegel think that philosophy should be concerned with institutions rather than practices? And I would say because our practices at the level of objective spirit involve choice and ownership, because the various values need to be mediated and given official legal standing. Hegel does not think that the perfectionist framework for individual virtue is something philosophy should try to explicate. The perfection, such as it is, lies in the institutional virtues. Philosophy gives the rough outlines of the good life and is compatible, I think, with some range of accounts of virtue. The right is a unifying conception insofar as it overcomes the distinction between internal and external goods, and insofar as it respects the power of self-consciousness, the power of each to think for themselves and to choose their own way of living a valuable life. Value on this view is not created or merely chosen, but it matters that one sees the values as a freely adopted expression of who one is. So I'm getting close to the end here. In a sense, Hegel agrees with MacIntyre that the Enlightenment project of justifying morality fails. He thinks that pure reason and the empirical study of human nature cannot on their own provide a substantive morality of rules. Yet the answer is not a full-blown return to pre-modern, pre-right community of virtue, but rather to embrace the modern social, economic, and political order as an alternative to the moral point of view. Hegel argues, in effect, that a fulfilling life will be one led within an ensemble of institutions, family, civil society, state. You fulfill the demands of your universal telos by doing your duty in those contexts. Those communities are supplemented by shared worship and shared engagement with artistic expression. Philosophy can help us see how all of this makes sense, where a big part of that means reconceiving our ideals of equality, justice, and freedom. I should also note, though, that Hegel does want to avoid a drastic lowering of expectations. In the Philosophy of Right introduction, he says he is not advocating, quote, that cold despair which confesses that in this temporal world things are bad or at best indifferent, but that nothing better can be expected here. So that for this reason alone, we should live at peace with actuality. The peace which cognition establishes with the actual world has more warmth in it than this. So we're not aiming for resignation, for a realism that says we have no choice but to like our lot, mediocre as it is. But our imagination of what could be better, our castles in the air, are many and various, and we are easily misled into pessimism and hopelessness. All right. I have time, 2 more paragraphs. In conclusion, I must confess that I really still do love the way that Aristotelianism and neo-Marxist critical theory meet in MacIntyre's project. I think we need unsparing criticism of the shallowness of the present age, and I think the worldviews of the past are essential to thinking about the present. So let me just mention 2 places where I would want to look longer and harder with MacIntyre at the tendencies of the present. The treatment of work and management that he gives is more pressing, I think, and more relevant than ever. I take it that we should want work to be practice-like, if not a practice in his full sense of the term. We want there to be excellence that we pursue as virtue and that extends human capabilities. Some of us, by fortune and effort, find ourselves with such work, but many, or even most, do not. And for those of us in secure practice-like work, the managerial class is encroaching with metrics that claim to aim for excellence, but that threaten to undermine the virtue of the practice by a bogus quantification. The goods internal to most practices cannot be quantified. Though I have argued that Hegel was right to accept the thinner forms of value in mediating his institutions, output-driven metrics of value are signs of managerial thinking run amok. I would like us to think very hard about how to check the values of efficiency and the promotion and shareholder-driven demand for growth of customers or growth of the number of underlings under one's supervision. Finally, the charge of false consciousness in the opening of After Virtue continues to fascinate me. Disquieting is a subtly menacing term for a condition in which a catastrophic failure of meaning has been concealed from the very people who are suffering from the loss. That we are alienated in some sense from our true selves without even knowing it is a hard pill to swallow. Inspired by a certain Cartesian cinematic fantasy, pill-taking has come to stand for the revelation of the sham world that has been pulled over our eyes by the liberal elite. Our world is indeed in many ways extremely superficial, and our world is certainly the product of centuries of Enlightenment thought. But what would it really mean to go back behind that development to some deeper reality? Could we expect to regain what we like about this or that pre-Enlightenment world without turning back the progress of right? Can we be sure that power and domination would not be the result of stripping away our discourses of right in favor of virtue? There's certainly something enticing about the quasi-aristocratic ethos in Nietzsche, in Strauss, and in MacIntyre. And we do seem somewhat disingenuous when we claim that we aim for human excellence and yet we insist on human equality. But we are able to think reality on different levels at once, and we should not let ourselves be cornered into taking any single narrative about this world as the only truth there is. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was excellent. So the first question for Robert Pippin. I think you're muted. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Dean. That's a very rich paper, a lot of moving parts to put together. I want to ask you, perhaps unfairly, an extremely general question. It has to do with your earlier remarks on anti-foundationalism and the problem of teleology, or the telos that occupied the first half of your paper. But really, my question is inspired by Hegel's remark that the last thing philosophy should be trying to do is tell the world how it ought to be. And that means, together with the claims about anti-foundationalism, that in a way, the question is whether Hegel shares with MacIntyre the fact that we need a coherent theory of virtue, or a coherent theory, philosophical theory of ethical life, in order for the drift of modernity towards a kind of benign nihilism can be thwarted. I'm not sure Hegel thinks anything like that, given the comment about the last thing we ought to try to do is tell the world how it ought to be. So, of course, as you know, that naturally shifts our attention back to the historical narrative that's so important for Hegel, that might help us explain why the goal, the telos of, let's say, mutuality of recognition has become significant or important. There's certainly historical traditions in which it hasn't. So there's something about this particular narrative, this particular development by internal critique and all the rest of the dialectical apparatus that Hegel invokes that makes getting the mutuality of recognition the proper form of inferentialism, the difference between formal and material inference, the right way to think about the individual and the community, why it's important to get all that right theoretically. Now, Brandom handles this with a kind of spectacular emphasis on the revolution in modernity and what he thinks of as its central problem, given the relationship between practical attitudes and social status. It creates the danger of arbitrariness and relativism that he thinks we need to work out by this proper understanding of the relations of authority between or among mutually recognitive persons. But that raises an extremely general question if he's an anti-foundationalist, and if it doesn't turn out that modern ethical life is good because it corresponds to the right theory of ethical life. I mean, the question could be put really very, very simply. Could the history of Western Geist have been different? You know, if it couldn't have been different, then there's something else going on with teleology, rather than, you know, kind of internal self-development alone. There's something about the status of the internal self-development that has to be defended, especially when we consider the uniqueness of the Western conception of itself. So maybe I'll just leave it at that and pose this tremendously unfair question because it's so broad. Could Western history and the emergence of the problem of mutuality, the recognition that there's a problem between equality and justice or equality and virtue, could that have been different?
Yeah, thank you, Mo, for that. I'm going to choose to answer your longer remarks and hopefully get to your more simple question towards the end of it. I mean, the question of what is the status of teleology in Hegel's view? How should we think about it? Because he says in the philosophy of right, and when he introduces the good, this is the final purpose of the world. And he says that not in a, but I don't mean that. I'm going to take it back. This is just a hypocritical. But he actually says that, and he repeats it in various points, that the good, which is basically a collection of everything that's come up to that point already in the book, is the final purpose of the world. And he obviously has lots of positive things to say about teleology in general, that we shouldn't have given up on Aristotelian teleology, that we really can't get started in philosophy without that. So I want to say that his overall answers to a whole range of philosophical problems turns on his having teleology, internal purposiveness that he takes from Kant as his central logical solution to all these problems. Now, having said that, is it a determinate theory of teleology? Well, he says in the absolute idea and the logic that there's a drive of the absolute idea, that it's process. And he's just telling you the method of his philosophy there. He's not then giving you a picture of what it looks like. So I take it this, goes back to some of the things that came up in the discussion of Bob Stern's paper too, that what it means to be a post-Kantian, I wouldn't say perfectionist, but to have a post-Kantian teleology is to have one where you don't have a fixed picture in view, that what you have is a process and a lot of already determined historically and naturally material for that process that then continues to get dialectically worked out. So, I mean, the stuff in Encyclopedia 552 that I always come back to, where he says we've reached this convergence of ethical conscience, religious conscience, and philosophical concept. And so that's great. That's what it means to have freedom in the modern world. And he says you're liberated, but you're also always being liberated, so that there can't be a dichotomy between where you are and where you're going that would make the now completely hopeless because it's so far from the end, but would also not eliminate the fact that there is some place further to go. On the question now, trying to finally answer your hardest version of the question, could it have been different? My sense is that it could have been different in a lot of detail. And I haven't tried to defend this really. It could have been different in many, many of its details. But once you have thought and life set in interaction and relation to each other, that seems to me, and this is why there's this mystery out of where this comes from in Phenomenology chapter 4, that just sort of seems like the point at which before that we can't really understand these questions about, well, what happens, but if we never had learned to think, or like those questions just don't make sense. But once we had learned to abstract, then this setting up this relationship between thinking and the concept and life, then we're on a path that's going to lead us in some way, could have been totally different, but in some way would lead us eventually to where we are. And so that may make me more, I mean, what I say about the theory of value is that there are two roots to it. So in some sense, roots, R-O-O-T-S, they're maybe, I don't really think of them as foundations, but that once you have those two elements, self-consciousness or thought on the one hand, and the living natural beings that we are on the other hand, then a lot of what processes of recognition are doing, starting from the beginning of fighting to the death, is trying to stabilize that relationship somehow. And that's just what our conceptions of value and the good are, trying to stabilize that conception, that relation between life and thought. And yeah, maybe I'll stop there instead of more.
Well, I mean, just one brief follow-up.
Yeah.
That sounds like a no to me. No, au fond, it couldn't have been different, given that there's this dynamic that comes from the relation between self-consciousness and life that has a kind of inner propositiveness to it. I mean, yeah, I agree with you about the details. Do we need the particular dynamics of marriage in Hegel to get to? Yeah, we can. But the general point would still be that there's a telos in the stronger, in a way one could say more robustly Aristotelian sense that makes it, and that makes other societies in which what has emerged historically as significant to them incomplete versions of the West. I mean, can one be a Hegelian without just buying into that? Just, you have to say, yes, they are.
Yeah, I'll take the next question.
Okay. So Bob Stern.
Thanks very much, Shane. That was great. I've got sort of two, I think they're connected, but I think two just comment or questions. So one issue that seemed to come out, if I understood you right, is as a possible tension between Hegel and MacIntyre was, I think you emphasized quite a lot the place that Hegel wants to give to Willkür. I think that was the theme, right? You're nodding, so I'll take that as a yes. And I suppose I wondered if a response was, I mean, actually, as you know, I think Hegel mentions Willkür, but then he rose back on it pretty heavily, really. So it is a moment of the modern, but very much then put in its place, I think. So I wondered if that makes a difference to the sort of dialectic with MacIntyre on that. And then the other question was, again, maybe too broad a question, but I mean, you take the trajectory as, you know, Hegel's issues are running through in various ways, ending up with issues of recognition, and then how are we going to flesh those out and make sense of those in various ways, etc., etc. But I suppose I still want to come back to sections 5 to 7 of the philosophy of right. They seem to me the engine of the whole book, right? And again, maybe you just think I'm naive, but I don't see anything about recognition as the fundamental problem there. I see the problem as being, well, look, if I will something particular, don't I seem to lose my freedom as a kind of universal subject? But if I don't will something particular, I don't will, right? I just remain this empty universal subject. Now, that seems to me what the whole book is that problem is the one that the book's designed to solve. Now, maybe you think I'm just weird and, no, it's all about how do we achieve mutual recognition, and that's the really important issue. But I just wondered what you think about sections 5 to 7, because again, maybe my reading's too flat-footed, but it doesn't seem to be. I mean, things like recognition will turn out to be part of the answer, an important part of the answer to that problem. But that's not what's driving the book fundamentally. I just wondered if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, to answer that question first, I mean, I guess I do think mutual recognition is the answer to that problem. So I agree with you that the problem of getting moments 5 and 6 together is the central problem. But I think the answer, in his very opaque, in some ways, conception of individuality, is fundamentally about mutual recognition. And I don't want to make too much of the example of friendship that he gives there, but if we think about how you remain universal in something determinate, he's typically going to say something about social relations and necessary relations to others. And then, I mean, so there's that's I'm trying to think if that is to agree with you or to say that our positions shouldn't be as far apart as you seem to think they are. But also, there's these comments in Abstract Right where he says, well, this whole account, because it's objective spirit, presupposes mutual recognition. And there's a question of what we do with that, with those discussions there. And I worry a little bit in your version, in your paper, that you had, I'm not sure you were trying to do this, but you didn't kind of thematize Abstract Right. And it's important to my version of the contrast between Hegel and MacIntyre that Abstract Right is totally fundamental, and that means that Hegel's doing political philosophy in a way from the beginning of objective spirit. And so the fact that him and MacIntyre are somewhat hard to compare is because, as came up before, it's just not clear that MacIntyre wants to do political philosophy. And yet, given what he criticizes about other views, it seems like he can't simply avoid it. And so then we're back. And so I think that touches on this, your first question too, which is this question about choice. Because, yeah, I mean, we definitely have somewhat of a disagreement about your paper on Luther. I don't think he's as much of a Lutheran as you do. Just because choice keeps coming up at various points, and the celebration of subjective freedom generally, as romantic love and conscience and so on, it seems very hard to take choice out of that picture. So as I said, I remain convinced that the bark is worse than the bite, but I also think it's that element that if you don't pay attention to it, makes it too easy to assimilate the philosophy of right to like an ordinary perfectionist ethical theory. Whereas I think you have to take it as building off of personality or personhood and private property, because without those elements, it would be a different book. And once you bring those elements in, then it becomes much more complicated to compare a theory to MacIntyre's. And I want to see them as doing the same thing, but I want to see Hegel as sort of taking this realist modern political stance because he sees the question of choice and individual right and property as just something you can't get away from.
But doesn't that all get heavily mediated as you read through the book? So yes, you start there, but you don't end up there, I don't think. And once you've done all the heavy mediating, yeah, it's not really clear how far apart they are. But
well, yeah, I mean, I agree to a great extent, but then, what is civil society as a theory of the selfish individual doing in the middle of ethical life, if not serving?
Yeah, but again, it's heavily mediated.
Right.
You start there, it's chipped away at progressively as you read on, right? So not dispensed with, but anyway, but that seems to me, important.
Great. We're running out of time, but I want to get to every question, so maybe we can just try to be brief. But let's go with race. Is that correct?
Thank you. Yes, Reese. Just a brief, the point that you kind of made briefly about asking how contemptible the modern bourgeois situation that you find yourself in actually is. You know, the things we do to kind of live, I think was very interesting. And I was wondering if you've ever engaged with the work of Georg Simmel, because as a person who grew up in a small town in a relatively empty state, one thing that I've noticed in my life, which Simmel describes well, is that the idea of modern life, the modern state of life, is not universal across the board. And there is an important conception of community, I think, which needs to be considered to combat some of the things which both Hegel and MacIntyre seem concerned about. You know, that there doesn't have to be a divide between the modern and the ancient, as some people kind of dichotomize it, but rather looking at the questions of what elements of the contemporary and the past were alienating, and how was that alienation possible in being overcome, and kind of learning from that to help develop a community going forward.
I'm trying to think back to my education in social thought with Hans Joas, and so I can't really address your specific point about Simmel. Is there a way you'd formulate it as a kind of less Simmel-centric question?
I guess a general question would be, and I guess you don't really need an answer for this, but I think an engagement with people who tend to sit outside the realm of philosophy might be useful for engaging with Simmel, Weber, post-Simmelian and Weberian social theorists for asking some of these very tangible questions that you seem to be engaging with, as a kind of parallel to the more high theory of Weber and MacIntyre. So I was just wondering, I guess, if you had tried that or considered that or anything like that.
Well, yeah, I'm not entirely sure which way to go with that question, but I mean, I think the answer is yes. I would see that as incredibly fruitful. I think, as I said kind of briefly, I think I've grown skeptical of Nietzsche sort of railing against the last man and dismissing the host of people with living finite lives, doing finite things, and not engaged in heroic projects. So I appreciate all engagements with sort of ordinary life and its portrayals. Again, you know, partly this question that I try to work on of value, the heterogeneity of value, how you see that in concrete circumstances. And then once you see that, how it then is bound up with more systematic and theoretical conceptions of value. So yeah, thanks for that.
Great. Greg? Greg Biba? Or Ahmad, why don't you go ahead and go?
Thank you, Dean. Thanks for the great talk. So in regards to one of the themes in your paper was this kind of different conclusions in MacIntyre and Hegel. So, you know, on the one hand, you have MacIntyre who views Enlightenment in large part as a result of a failure or marginalization of Aristotelian teleology, either due to the kind of failure of the mechanics underwriting the metaphysics, or the problems that arose with reinterpretation of the components of Aristotle's teleology in more modern terms that kind of contributed to undermining Aristotle's account, which kind of needn't have happened. And kind of MacIntyre's account keeps this kind of stochastic indeterministic framework that's kind of outlined in his pre-after virtue writings in the 70s, especially. But on the other hand, like Hegel sees the Enlightenment as a kind of necessary revolution in subjectivity and realization of human freedom. And this kind of comes about as kind of a reorientation of our own self-image. And while we kind of lose the grounding in the world from, you know, our historical journey from the Greeks, something greater, like namely freedom, is gained. but this more importantly, this movement is seen as necessary. So I mean, this is the kind of fundamental thing that kind of separates MacIntyre and Hegel. So while this kind of difference allows Hegel to be kind of at home, and while critical, but at home in modernity, this eludes MacIntyre, and then this kind of separation in their conception of right, why it's kind of undermined or it doesn't have a pride place for MacIntyre, but it does for Hegel.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds right to me. I don't think I would disagree with anything that you said. So I would just say thank you for that. And now that I've learned from Bob that you wrote about possible MacIntyrean political philosophy, I want to hear more about that. And I must also say that I was a little bit surprised by Bob Stern's talk because, you know, part of me thought that MacIntyre can't be totally serious about the good life. It's just the quest for the good life. And that this is why I think I implicitly read his later view back into After Virtue, just because that doesn't seem substantive enough, but also because I have these worries about how could you get a political philosophy out of that. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Hey, Greg, you wanna go?
Yeah, thanks much. I don't know, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine here.
Good. Thanks so much for a really thoughtful and thought-provoking paper. I want to just make a little comment about the second to last paragraph, where you talked about the manager and then those of us that work in practices that are thick, where we're pursuing goods in those practices, but we're also sort of surrounded by administrators who want to quantify everything, and bureaucrats and so forth, and just point to the literature among the MacIntyreans. I mean, Caleb, who's hosted this, is certainly one of the main writers in this. Jeff Moore, Ron Beadle. I think it's a minority view among the MacIntyreans. There's other people on the program that are MacIntyreans that I think don't always agree with these MacIntyreans who want to work out this dialectic that you pointed to. But I just wanted to point to that literature. Jeff Moore's book, Virtue at Work, I think is really good, and thinking through the issues that you raised in that paragraph. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much for letting me know about this now. And I'm anxious to go back and read all of this. And I had not really engaged with MacIntyre for a long time. And so I'm really just doing it now as a result of this great conference. And I will definitely check out that work, because it does seem like, yeah, there is this kind of proto-Marxist, or what grew out of his thinking about Marxist concerns about capitalism. And I certainly don't want to, I mean, that's a part of MacIntyre I think is great and I really like. And in giving the view of Hegel as this kind of realist who's okay with paying taxes and so on, I wouldn't want to make him somebody who would celebrate everything that's happened in the last 200 years in economics. So it's super interesting for me to know that there's a literature that's picking up these ideas in MacIntyre. Thank you.
We're a little bit over, but I saw, did I see Matthias Haza, did you want to go with your question, or if you had a quick
That's
one?
okay. We're running a little late, so I can
Okay,
send
great.
an email.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. That was a great discussion, great paper. And so we'll maybe take a couple minute break and kind of pick up with Kelvin Knight.